Hello, so we'll begin in a couple of minutes. I hope you can hear me. I have to teach another in Ontario, previous to this class on Thursday. So hopefully the sound is okay. I'm also going to record a version of this lecture and put it online. So I will upload a recording as well. Next week is reading week. So we have a week off and we won't be meeting. And then we'll be meeting after reading week. So we will meet again on Tuesday, the 27th. So I'll wait a few more minutes for people to enter. Again, I hope the sound is okay.
It makes a lot longer. Yeah. You can turn them into videos now. You know that? Oh, it'll use live. I learned that with Zara.
So we discussed Indigenous issues last class in detail, and I'll discuss Indigenous issues again for the next couple of weeks, this week and the week after reading week. And so I'm going to discuss Sherene Razack's article, and I'll also discuss the idea of the article regarding identity formation and indigeneity. I'll talk more about Jeff Corntassel's article next week as well, but I want to discuss the Razack article extensively for the next 2 weeks. So I will talk about it the most, I guess, for the next 2 weeks, because it is a really dense article theoretically, but I think it's a really interesting discussion. And Sherene Razack discusses Indigenous issues from a number of theoretical perspectives, drawing on Giorgio Agamben and drawing on other post-colonial and feminist scholars. In 2011, 36-year-old Cindy Gladue, a Cree woman, bled to death in a hotel bathtub in Edmonton, Alberta, Canada. On the night she died, Gladue had contracted for sexual exchange with Bradley Barton, a white man who worked as a trucker. In 2015, Barton was tried for the murder of Cindy Gladue. With more than 1,200 missing and murdered Indigenous women, there is compelling reason to focus on the violence Barton inflicted on Gladue, understanding it as a part of a history of the sexual brutalization and attempted annihilation of Indigenous women. To show that Gladue's death and the trial of Barton for her murder are part of a history of colonial terror, it is necessary to unpack the framework utilized by the court, a framework that revolved around the ideas of consent and contract. I propose that we utilize a framework of disposability instead, focusing on the Indigenous woman's expendability in settler colonialism. Sexualized violence is key to disposability, and flesh is the site at which racial and sexual power are both inscribed. I emphasize the excessive violence that is meted out to Indigenous women as evidence of colonial power imprinted on their bodies. So, in the initial reporting of the murder, Cindy Gladue's Indigenous origin did not merit a mention, and media coverage was sparse. So, few people seem to notice the death of an Indigenous woman in the context of sex work. And what is interesting is this idea of noticing and not noticing. So when people are not white, often I would argue that it is something that someone notices right away, but one cannot actually say, oh, you're not white, because it seemed to be rude. And Cindy was an Indigenous woman in Edmonton, Alberta, and I think that people did notice she was Indigenous. I also think this is why she was precariously employed and unemployed and often precariously housed and ended up in a high risk industry like sex work. In 2015, however, the outcry over introducing the body part as evidence in the trial of Barton for her murder was vociferous, and several commentators considered the implication of such a move when the woman in question was Indigenous and working in prostitution. So this then goes back to Bradley Barton, who was accused of murdering Cindy Gladue, and Bradley Barton was a white man. And again, someone might notice that Bradley Barton was a white man if they have met anyone else before in the world, and anyone else who isn't on trial for murder who is not a white man. Let's say my dad, an aerospace engineer who worked on the Canada Space Arm. So certain people then are highly visible to others, and people might try not to notice this visibility, but they might also make note of it and treat people differently or with suspicion. So the trial of Cindy Gladue touched a nerve that for many had to do with Canada's 1,200 missing and murdered Indigenous women. And this idea of disposability is about what people see and what people do not see. So there are other comparable examples, like someone might not notice, or someone might notice right away that a person has a disability, but they might not say anything. This does not mean that the person would not be persecuted for having a disability. Gender identity could be the same. And obviously, just things like gender itself. So Sarah Everard was a British woman, and Sarah Everard was an ethnically white British woman who was 34 years old and went for a walk in London, England, and was killed by Wayne Couzens, who was an unemployed man who had who was said to have mental health issues supposedly, and he did kill this woman. So when you are a woman, someone might not constantly say, oh, look, it's a woman, or oh, you're a woman, but you will obviously be treated in certain ways as what cultural theorists would call a marked body. And when you are a marked body, you can be marked as disposable. So the fabrication of disposable peoples throughout history points to the permanence of a specific construction of otherness, in which the excess of enjoyment is expressed to the transformation of a human being into matter. So Sherene Razack in this article draws on Francois Vergas, and Francois Vergas is a post-colonial scholar who wrote extensively about Frantz Fanon. And Francois Vergas was interested in the ways that people become disposable throughout history. And she wrote extensively about colonialism in France and colonialism in French Africa, and the ways that people become disposable to the colonial project. So if colonialism is a project of trying to seize lands, trying to make money, trying to control people, how do certain people become useful in colonial history, and how do they become disposable? So I would argue that the disposability of certain people like Cindy Gladue is about a certain historical moment in nation building in Canada. So I should tell you that the articles for this week and next week, and also the lectures, contain some graphic imagery and graphic narratives. about the murder of Cindy Gladue, and you are welcome to log out if you feel the material is too graphic or the descriptions. And when I post the recorded lecture online, you can obviously fast forward. You can decide also not to do your presentation on the articles that are about Cindy Gladue because the cases are quite gruesome. So the Crown Attorney in the case of Cindy Gladue argued that the 11-centimeter wound had been caused by a knife used by Bradley Barton in a bid to demonstrate its theory about the knife. And on the advice of the senior pathologist in the case, the Crown introduced as evidence Cindy Gladue's vagina, tissue apparently severed from the rest of her body. The judge permitted the severed body of the pelvic area to be viewed on a screen behind which the pathologist testified, as he pointed to the actual tissue. Barton was acquitted of all charges and the case is on appeal. So Bradley Barton has appealed over and over and over again. Despite being found guilty, he can just keep, he can appeal. And this use of Cindy Gladue's body part is again about being hyper visible, but not being ever kind of told the truth. So you can be kind of on display for others, but people can consistently refuse to tell you that they notice that you are not white and a woman or a person with a disability. It is just the sense of being a spectacle, but also unspeakable. The problem with being a spectacle and being unspeakable is that in the eyes of the law, you can be seen and then be seen as someone who could be killed or seen as somebody who is disposable. But the language of race and gender in this time period is often censored. So in the initial reporting of the murder, Gladue's Indigenous origin did not merit a mention and media coverage was sparse. So the refusal to name Cindy Gladue as an Indigenous woman is a really tactical refusal to name race in cases where it's obviously because of a woman's Indigenous origin that she is murdered. So Sarah Ahmed writes, if whiteness gains its currency by going unnoticed, what does it mean to notice whiteness? And Ahmed is interested in the ways that race becomes invisible, but obviously invisible in order to carry a certain currency. So if Bradley Barton had been someone else, a South Asian Canadian, a Black Canadian man, a Muslim Canadian man, perhaps his identity as a white man would have been named. But when you have a certain currency, you often keep your currency by not kind of exposing it to be a form of theft. So if I have a lot of money, I wouldn't want people to know, well, I've stolen it all because, and I'm going to steal it all over 2 or 3 or 4 or 7 generations, much like the Indian caste system. So I would not want that to be exposed because then laws would be passed. And of course, India has had laws passed against the caste system since the 1970s and 80s. So this kind of currency then of being white in settler Canada is really about trying to seize land, try to have control over industry, try to consistently make money and do harm to others without anyone noticing. And of course, in this time period, people have noticed, and there is the Missing and Murdered Indigenous Women and Girls report, the TRC Commission report, and the United Nations. So Nurbiz Philip is an author who has written an article about Carla Homolka and Paul Bernardo. So Carla Homolka and Paul Bernardo were accused of killing multiple women together as a couple. And so they were this couple who killed young women together. And Nervise Philip has argued that the fact that they were white is one of the reasons that Carla Homolka and Paul Bernardo killed multiple women and were not put in jail for quite a long time. One of the most pernicious effects of the construction of whiteness in the New World was the projection of all negative characteristics onto the other. Whiteness is highly visible while simultaneously being invisible. Invisible because in a society steeped in racism and ethnocentric ideology, white and whiteness became equated with normalcy. So despite her involvement in these crimes, however, at some fundamental level, the image of Carla Homolka remains untouched, and whiteness once again becomes a shield and is shielded. So what's interesting for Nervise Phillips is how much the media had so much sympathy for Carla Homolka. And Carla Homolka, in many of her trials, was referred to as a victim of domestic violence. And the crimes that Carla Homolka committed were not crimes against her husband. And they were extreme crimes of perversion and sadism against other women. But Nervise Phillips argues that because Carla Homolka was white, she was in many ways constantly made to be a victim rather than an aggressor. So there are all these metaphors and kind of tropes that were attached to Bernardo and Homolka that are really about these two people who were accused of being serial killers. They were really about these two people being innocent. So the media in Maclean's magazine, Megan Thomas decided to make a comparison between Carla Homolka and Mona Lisa. Carla Homolka, well aware that her day will end in a jail cell, looking at the camera with a dark, disinterested stare, flushed cheeks, and brightly painted lips that suggest the barest hint of a smile. But it's those menacing, half-mouthed eyes that make award-winning Canadian press photographer Frank Gunn's 1993 picture of Homolka such an enigma. A true crime Mona Lisa that remains the definitive image of Canada's most infamous female felon. So the image of Mona Lisa remains this image that Megan Thomas goes back to when describing Homolka. And so you can think about the idea that Razack puts forward that certain people are disposable and other people will always be with us in our courts, in our jails, in our system of appeals, in our media, in our tell-all books. And Carla Homolka is one of those people. So Carla Homolka is kept as our Mona Lisa, while many Indigenous women and girls are killed. And so the Mona Lisa is really this kind of proto-feminist character as well, who meets our eyes directly. And there are times when Carla Homolka is depicted as a victim, and also the fact that she, like all of her appearance during trials is often talked about, how she still kind of looks a certain way. And so Carla Homolka is given all of this almost legitimacy, even though she's on trial for murder. And what Nervise Phillips argues is that this is because Carla Homolka is white. So this is a clip about Carla Homolka.
Communicate in English easily. Use Grammarly and feel confident with effective communication.
For days, the news has been spread.
Sorry, I don't know why.
For days, the news has been spreading around the neighborhood.
To hear that some
a person like that, it's here, it's. And some residents like Gail Poo are unsettled. I was totally shocked. She's here? Oh my God. Get out of here. Since her release from prison in 2005, Carla Homolka has kept a low profile, changing her name to Leanne Teal, and for the past 2 years reportedly living in this suburb south of Montreal with her husband and 3 children. Many residents just learned that after media reports this week.
It makes you uncomfortable, like, it's not like she was accused of, fraud or something. It's a pretty heinous crime.
2 of Homolka's children go to school here, and parents in the area are upset they didn't know.
I know everybody's saying about her kids, but like, what about our kids?
The school board sent a letter assuring parents their children are safe and saying all children have the right to privacy and an obligation to be in school.
She passed her sentence, so can you do it?
I don't know what to think. Where does she go? What should she do?
This criminal lawyer says legally Homolka has done her time.
Like it or not, she has the right to live her life like any other person without being subject to threats and harassment.
Homolka knew that was something she could face when she gave this interview to Radio-Canada after her release.
Je veux pas que le monde pense que je suis quelqu'un de dangereux qui vont faire quelque chose à leurs enfants.
Homolka served 12 years in prison after striking a plea deal for testifying against Paul Bernardo, but it was widely criticized because later evidence showed her to be a more active participant than she let on.
Those who say that she served her debt to society, I say no, she did not. She got away with murder.
Homolka is not talking to reporters. In an email, her former lawyer accused the media of conducting a public lynching and provoking hate and bullying against the children. Allison Northcott, CBC News, Chateauguay, Quebec.
So that is a
Create your happy place with bed.
Carla Homolka. Nervise Phillips is really interested in the ways that Bernardo and Homolka are represented in the media as white criminals, and not just any criminals, white criminals. So the Bernardos remain failed rap artists, and so the media also discussed, this was Maclean's and Toronto Star, also discussed the way that Paul Bernardo was led astray by rap music. And so Nervise Phillips argues that in many cases, when white men commit crime in Canada, there's always this other who has made them commit crime, like rappers. So the Bernardos remained failed rap artists, the Homolka's intelligent Mona Lisas with pouting lips. And so this positive representation, Phillips argues, is inextricable from their whiteness. Whiteness means that Carla Homolka and Paul Bernardo, after raping, degrading, killing, and dismembering young women, could think themselves better than the thousands of hardworking immigrants, dark-skinned immigrants to Toronto, whose moral status is infinitely superior to theirs. So one of the reasons that Carla Homolka and Paul Bernardo could not live in Toronto, even during and after the trials and appeals, was that Toronto was too multicultural. And so there were all of these associations with them as actually being innocent people who needed to be protected. And if one looks at the accusations of what they did, so Carla Homolka is a Canadian serial killer who acted as an accomplice to her husband, Paul Bernardo, taking active part in murders and rapes of at least 3 minors in Ontario, including her own sister, Tammy Homolka, between 1990 and 1992. So excessive violence is something that Sherene Razack discusses a great deal in her article. Or she discusses it in almost painstaking detail in the article, which is, I think, a remarkable attempt to really understand the murder of Cindy Gladue and also the public reaction, the media reaction, and the legal redress that followed the accused murder of Cindy Gladue, or the supposed murder of Cindy Bryant. So Razack writes, I consider the excessive violence that is meted out to Indigenous women, arguing that in the colonial imagination, the goal is to destroy the figural unity of the body of the Indigenous person and to transform it into waste. I explore the gendered pattern of this attempted annihilation, uncovering the scope of regime that anchors it. When Indigenous women's bodies are destroyed in the extreme way that we see in murdered Indigenous women, the value of their bodies in the social order is made clear. I suggest that the scopic regime of sexualized violence is key to disposability. The violence that is written on the flesh tells the colonial story of whose bodies have value. The wounds and injuries are pedagogical. They teach us the limits of the human, a lesson Barton learned when he inflicts the injuries that the public was taught when they were invited to view them at the trial. So this kind of enjoyment of violence and enjoyment of the destruction of Indigenous women and girls' bodies is something that Sherene Razack discusses at length in her article. Far from rough sex gone wrong, the violence that ended Gladys' life reveals the dehumanization and disposability that is at the heart of colonial slave white supremacist regimes. The Indigenous body on which coloniality is written has been fully described by Indigenous scholars. As Emma LaRocque, Andrea Smith, and others have written, the Indigenous female is seen as licentious, sexually available, imbued with sexual sin, and inherently rapeable, a racial marking that effaces the sexual violence so routinely visited on Indigenous women and that attributes it to their own base natures. The marking of the sexually licentious woman is intimately tied to dispossession, enabling Indigenous populations to be considered as primitive and barbaric and unfit owners of the land. The symbolic mark finds its material base when extreme poverty, sexual violence, and addiction drive many Indigenous women into prostitution. So the justification of theft of others' lands and property has been true throughout colonial history. So constructing people in India and Pakistan as being unworthy of the things that they own, their own property, their own buildings, became a justification for violent seizure of other people's property and things. As an important part of the colonial project, the sexualized violence meted out to Indigenous women must be made visible. So again, this question about what is visible and invisible is central to settler colonialism, that the media has to depict violence against Indigenous women and girls to continue to construct very negative ideas about Indigenous women and girls, and also to consistently make this violence very clear and visible. The violence must establish that Indigenous women are collectively sexually violable and that Indigenous lands are occupied. However, race and whiteness and systemic racism in Canada often goes unnamed. The privileges of white women and white people are often unnamed and make people uncomfortable to name. So one can display violence, but without naming race or gender, then Indigenous women and girls are often called other things like a prostitute. To understand the role of the visual and the collective aspect of sexualized violence, it is helpful to consider the role of sexualized violence in slave regimes. As Catherine McKittrick has theorized, the logic of visualization, which is vital to slave regimes, is evident in all of its geographies. McKittrick's slave geographies include the auction block where sites of unprotected female flesh, which are sexually violently accessible, produce their protected white femininities, masculinities, and indirect relation, their homes, fields, and kitchens. The logic of visualization named by McKittrick, where display is central to how bodies are valued, the most valued body, that of the respectable white woman, is seldom displayed, underpins sexual encounters between Indigenous women and white men in the context of prostitution. When Gladys' body bears the visible imprint of Barton's power, Their encounter reconstitutes a colonial relationship. Barton's power made visible on Gladu's body establishes his power. As Alexander Wehely has shown, with respect to the marking of power on the Black subject, the visual is crucial to the moment when thingness, the reduction of a person to an object, and sensuality come together. So again, we can think about the relationship between what is visible and what is not. So when you reduce a person to an object, what is important is refusing to name the person, refusing to name them according to their own choice, their own gender pronouns, their own actual name, their own title to land as a Cree person, and their own claim to an allegiance to a community. But what becomes important is to objectify the body. And we've discussed Andrea Dworkin's work in previous lectures. And Andrea Dworkin was a very famous American feminist who was interested in the relationship between language and bodies. Laura Mulvey was also a very well-cited British film theorist and feminist. And Mulvey argued in the 1970s that when people make films, they often shoot women on film for their to-be looked atness. So advertising often objectifies certain parts of the female body. And there's no naming or personhood, there's just objectification. So the message written on the body in lacerations and wounds obscures desire. So any desire to have an intimate or personal relationship with another person is obscured through this constant objectification of the human body as an object to be violated, which is why the use of her actual genitalia in the court case is really about an evidence of colonial victory. And there are obviously comparisons made between Cindy Gladu's objectification and Sarah Bartman, who was the Hottentot Venus. It's another name used to refer to Bartman. Sarah Bartman was a woman who was put on display by colonizers, and she was put on display as kind of a trophy of colonial victory, and a trophy of slavery and colonialism. And the fact that she was a Black woman made her kind of a spectacle for people to look at. And Europeans would actually pay money just to look at this Black woman's body on display in Europe. And she died in Europe at a very young age, and it's a really horrible story. She was a Khoi woman from South Africa who was taken to England and just put on display for English people to see. And you could actually pay money to lift her skirt up and to see her genitalia. And this was done in the 18th and 19th century, and she died at a very young age. She never returned to the Khoi people. She never got to go home. She was essentially just kidnapped and put on display. So when people put genitalia on display in a court of law, it has all of these really disturbing historical reference. So the happening of desire takes place off the screen, off the map, off the charts, off the books, which is what renders the symbols etched into and written by the flesh indecipherable to the extent that they do not appear as desire. Returning to Barton, the wounds he inflicted on Gladu reassured him of his place in both a racial and patriarchal order. Simultaneously, his acts of violence convey that the encounter is not one of mutual pleasure, but rather one of dominance. Pleasure has to be disavowed if the colonial relationship is to remain intact.
Her about what he got told. Here, I got
So it is important to, I think, consider really basic human values when discussing cases of missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls and violence and public violence in general. One of the reasons that selves participate in societies is because we can supposedly or hopefully benefit by participating in a society. But when a society enacts violence against minorities, against populations that are ethnically cleansed, against women, people with disabilities, then the question would be, why do we even participate in a society? If there is no empathy that is offered to certain people, then can they even be can they ever be spoken of as being part of society? Does one just participate in society to pay taxes for other people to receive empathy and to have great lives? So empathy is one of the great philosophical debates of our time. And after the killing of George Floyd and all of the press about the murder of Trayvon Martin, who was an unarmed teenager who was killed by George Zimmerman, who was an off-duty, who was actually like what would be referred to as a fake cop, like someone pretending to be a cop, but he was actually a security guard who had been fired from being a security guard. And he was that impressive. And he killed Trayvon Martin. And so the question became, do people not have any empathy for Black people? And that was a question that theorists asked, political leaders asked it, talk show hosts asked this about this question of the empathy gap. So this is a clip about racial empathy or lack thereof.
But my mom said, I'm pretty fine. So everybody's gonna take care of it. But yeah, of course he does, and all he needed to involve in or involved in first.
Experiencing homelessness. So in the face of this, oh yeah, and I should say too that in this anti-empathy camp, the main figure is Paul Bloom, who has a 2016 book against empathy. But this debate between being for and against empathy, from a philosophical standpoint, needs some terminological clarification. Philosophers love to define our terms. We think it is very important. And so I think this leads to a question, which is, what is empathy? Because there is not a single accepted definition. Scholars have widely different definitions for empathy. For instance, Jacoboni defines it as the ability to share another's feelings. Amy Coughlin defines it as a complex imaginative process in which an observer simulates another person's situated psychological states while maintaining clear self-other differentiation. So you can see that Coughlin's definition of empathy is far more detailed than Jacoboni's, which means that she's probably going to define instances of empathy in a more delimited way than Jacoboni would. I also like, and you know this already if you've listened to my podcast or read my paper on sexual consent, returning to word origins and seeing what they have to tell us about the meaning of a word, even though, of course, we can only take that so far. But empathy actually has a really interesting history as a word. It only enters the English language in the early 20th century. The word empathy was coined in 1909 by the psychologist Edward Titchener as a translation of the German word Einfühlung, which means feeling into. And so Titchener wants to translate this German word Einfühlung, but he sees that we don't have a word for it in English. And so he invents this word empathy, I think probably in a riff off of sympathy. So it might seem like empathy has a Greek root, which sympathy does. Sympathy's Greek origin means to feel with, but actually empathy does not have a Greek root. Yeah, sure, it's drawing on pathos, the ancient Greek word for feeling, but you won't find the word empathy or like empatheia, an ancient Greek version of it, in any ancient Greek text, because this guy coined it in 1909. But in fact, the German word Einfühlung is itself quite recent as well. It was coined by the philosopher Theodor Lipps in the late 19th century. And I think it bears mentioning here that Lips originally coined the term Einfühlung as a description for the experience that we have of the work of art. So empathy did not originate as a word for how we encounter other people, but rather as a word for how we encounter art. And I think this origin of empathy suggests a couple of really interesting things. First, empathy is an aesthetic experience in the broad sense. Whether it involves perceiving another person or a work of art, it pertains to our senses, or aesthesis in the Greek. Second, both works of art and persons appear within the sensory field as expressive wholes that signify meaning. We'll see later on that this distinguishes these types of bodies from other entities in the world. So the methods that I'm using in general in a lot of my philosophical work, and certainly in my work on empathy, are the methods of phenomenology. And so this idea that the empathy signals the presence of an embodied whole is very similar to a lot of phenomenological views of how we perceive others. And Lips's original theory of empathy serves as the direct basis for the line of thinking about empathy that I want to particularly draw our attention to, which is the phenomenological view. Phenomenology is a school of thought that was invented in the early 20th century in Germany by Edmund Husserl and was developed by other European thinkers, including Edith Stein, Martin Heidegger, Maurice Merleau-Ponty, and Simone de Beauvoir. Generally speaking, phenomenology is the study of lived experience, and it really involves patient ways of attending to the ways that we experience ourselves and environments as embodied, situated creatures. Phenomenology, I think, thus provides a really useful counterpoint to the scientific studies of empathy, which tends to dominate. Whereas the natural sciences presume a third-person objective observer, phenomenology emphasizes the indispensability of the first-person perspective. In addition, phenomenology has been studying empathy for over 100 years. This is long before scientists discovered the mirror neurons that sparked the new interest in empathy starting in the 1990s. And as a result, there are a lot of cognitive scientists who have come to acknowledge that phenomenology provides resources that enrich the inquiries of science. But I also think at the same time that dominant views of empathy in both the cognitive sciences and in analytic philosophy of mind haven't sufficiently taken seriously the challenges that phenomenology poses to their views of empathy. So I want to back out now and say a little bit more about how philosophers and cognitive scientists sometimes conceive of empathy, and then talk specifically about what I think phenomenology offers. So most scholars agree that empathy is experientially and logically grounded in a differentiation between self and other. So just because there are mirror neurons doesn't mean that there's no distinction between self and other. In fact, the very presence of mirror neurons shows that there is a distinction because I'm not actually doing the other's action for them. I am experiencing it in a sort of secondhand way through my mirror neurons. But a question arises then, which is, how does empathy allow us to experience the other as a conscious being with feelings? In order for a theory of empathy to prove convincing, it has to address the philosophical issue that is known as the problem of other minds. That is, how do I know that I'm empathizing with another person and not just an object in the world, say a robot? Who's to say that I'm not simply projecting my consciousness onto the other? Let's say that I grant that there are other consciousnesses. Even with that, important questions still emerge. How is it possible for me to experience these other consciousnesses? Isn't consciousness an essentially private, first-person affair? How do I move from the perception of another's body to the perception of their consciousness? And outside of the bubble of phenomenology, which actually takes some of these problems to be pseudo-problems, schools of thought among philosophers of mind and neuroscientists are divided into two primary camps on this set of questions. These are known as simulation theory and theory theory. Simulation theory suggests that we empathize with other people by simulating their situation and imagining what we would do if we were in their shoes. When another person smiles, I imagine he is happy because I smile when I'm happy. And this offers me a simulation of the feeling of happiness. Now, this simulation theory involves shifting perspectives. It also arguably requires a degree of knowledge about the other person. In order to simulate the scenario of a stranger who comes from a widely different cultural background than I do, I need to know a lot about that person's background.
Okay, so what I would argue is that settler colonialism does not allow for the same process of empathy. So you smile and I think, oh, you're happy. I'm also happy, or I know what it's like to be happy. So I understand that when you're happy, I know what this means. But it's also if you cry, then I can recall crying myself and think, oh, that's awful. I've been sad before, horrible things. I've been given really sad news before, or bad news, and I've cried. So the problem is that settler colonialism does not construct bodies and lives to be the same. So Cindy Gladue had multiple children. She was a mother. And so if you were a mother, if you want to be a mother, would somebody empathize with her as a mother? The problem is that Cindy Gladue is not constructed as a person deserving empathy. She's constructed as a symbol of indigeneity and of indigeneity in opposition to settler colonialism. So her being a mother and having children is actually something that threatens settler colonial expansion. That if Indigenous people have more and more and more children, then the ongoing project of trying to seize Indigenous land is threatened. And I would argue that this kind of use of people as potential threats to the acquisition of land and to the acquisition of money and property by settlers is the reason that empathy does not form.
Simulation theorists thus often hold to the idea that empathy is a complex imaginative process, which is how we saw Copland define it above. In opposition to simulation theory is theory theory. Theory theory, which is just such a great name, claims that the subject possesses a theory of mind. That is, a sense that the other body has a mind with thoughts, feelings, and other aspects of conscious awareness. A subject doesn't need to be explicitly aware of possessing such a theory of mind, but one nonetheless acts on the basis of it. Here, one infers on the basis of facing another person that the person, like oneself, has a mind. When I see someone smile, according to a theory theorist, I speculate that that person's smile is coming from a particular feeling that person is experiencing in the moment. And because I theorize that their consciousness is structured similarly to my own, I conclude that their smile indicates that they are happy, and I empathize with that feeling. Theory theory is thus sometimes equated with a form of mind reading, in which we interpret another's thoughts and feelings on the basis of the signs given by their body. There are a couple of relevant differences between theory theory and simulation theory. First, they're different in terms of the mental faculties that they take to be the primary mechanism of empathy. For simulation theory, the relevant faculty is the imagination. For theory theory, the relevant faculty is reason or cognition. Second, these views are different in terms of the perspective that they emphasize. Simulation theory emphasizes the first-person perspective. It takes empathy to involve putting oneself in the first-person perspective of the other. Theory theory emphasizes the third-person perspective. It takes empathy to involve speculation about what the other themselves might be experiencing, because both views depend on an inferential model of self-other distinction, implying that empathy must overcome an originary gap between perceiving the other's body and perceiving the other's consciousness. The very premise that we experience other consciousnesses through inference, however, is misguided from the perspective of phenomenology. Because in phenomenology, we need to emphasize the embodied nature of consciousness, avoiding a mind-body dualism that would even make an inference necessary. In order to see how phenomenology unsettles the terms of the debate between simulation theory and theory theory, I want to investigate a little bit more the non-dualistic theory of embodied consciousness that I just mentioned. Phenomenology's answer to the problem of other minds is to say that there is no problem at all. Rather than needing to infer from another's body that she also has a mind, phenomenologists argue that others simply show up as consciousnesses in our perceptual field. It's only by projecting the intellectual assumption that there's a difference between bodies and minds that one worries about the existence of other consciousnesses at all. We might consider here the famous example from Descartes' Meditations, where Descartes looks out his window at the people in the street and wonders, and they're like wearing hats and coats, I think, and he wonders whether they might actually just be robots wearing hats and coats. There's nothing about their bodies, Descartes believes, that could guarantee that these others are not simply robots. One infers from the bodies of others that they are also minds, but nothing in the perceptual field guarantees this. because the perceptual field only pertains to bodies. For the phenomenologist, however, we can only separate mind from matter on the basis of having a preconceptual experience of minded matter. We need not decipher others' consciousnesses from their bodies. Rather, we encounter others as conscious bodies in our everyday life all the time. Phenomenology emphasizes the way that our own conscious bodies are always situated within a broader social context of other conscious bodies. And this doesn't mean that we can't ever be wrong about consciousnesses. It could be that I think somebody is a person when in fact they are a robot, right? Or I might take a statue to be a person until I get close to it. But according to phenomenology, these possibilities of error are the exceptions that prove the rule. The idea that we don't need to infer minds from bodies, but rather experience others directly as embodied conscious beings, is what is called the direct perception account. The direct perception account draws on a distinction between two words for body in the German language. As I mentioned, phenomenology originates in Germany. And the first word for the body that we find in the German language is Körper, which is the term for the body taken as a material thing. It's related to the English word corpse, but it doesn't necessarily need to mean a corpse. It's like the body that the doctor treats. It's this third person perspective on the body. It is the body, from the outside, not seen as a dynamic thing, or rather seen as a thing at all. The second term in the German language is the Leib, which is the lived body. And the absence of this distinction in English, combined with our deep-rooted biases in favor of dualism, often means that we take bodies only in the Körper sense, and thus posit that humans must have both the body and something in addition, namely a mind or a consciousness. But taken as Leib, the body is in essence expressive and animated. It exhibits consciousness. Maurice Merleau-Ponty compares the lived body to a work of art. In appreciating a painting, we don't take it to be a physical object that additionally has meaning. Rather, we consider the painting to be an expressive whole in which meaning and material are intertwined. This same is true of our experience of other lived bodies. They are expressive wholes. And this notion of the lived body has significant consequences for thinking about how we experience others in empathy. The phenomenologist Juna Taipale emphasizes that there is a distinction between thinking that our experience of others are conditioned by body perception and thinking that our experiences of them are mediated by our perception of our bodies. On Taipale's view, philosophers of mind have tended to conflate these two notions, when in fact they should be distinguished. It's uncontroversial to say that our experiences of others are conditioned by body perception. All this means is that we cannot directly experience others without experiencing them as bodies. But this doesn't necessarily mean that our experience of others are mediated by body perception, because mediation suggests that the body is a sign of consciousness rather than being of itself conscious. This idea that the body is a medium easily lends itself to the impression that empathizing with another person constitutes a form of mind reading. But Taipale points out that the metaphor of mind reading takes the bodily expression of the other to be similar to a chain of words, that is, a sign that leads to meaning, but in which the meaning does not lie in the words themselves. Words by nature are arbitrary signs that signal beyond themselves to concepts. This is not the way that our experience of others works. The body of another does not signal to a consciousness beyond the body that I am meant to grasp into some disembodied mind. Rather, the consciousness is already present in person, such that there is no mediation required. Of course, you might be thinking here that this view leads to a huge problem, because claiming that the other is an expressive whole that is immediately accessible to our consciousness might lead us into the trap of thinking that we know what's going on inside someone else's head. If I experience the other's embodied consciousness directly, how do I explain the fact that the other person's feeling is her feeling rather than mine? And this is where I think phenomenology gets even more interesting, because it suggests that saying that I directly experience the other's consciousness doesn't mean that I experience her consciousness in the way that she experiences it. Rather, I experience her consciousness directly, but in the second person. And I'm going to read a quote from Edmund Husserl here, the founder of phenomenology, who says, "In empathy, the empathizing I experiences the consciousness of the other I. But no one will say he lives it and perceives it in inner perception, just like his own consciousness." End of quote. So in empathy, we don't feel the other's pain as our own. Rather, we do feel it, but as the others. For Husserl then, empathy is precisely the experience that reveals the irreducible gap between one's ego and the ego of the other. There is no need to posit identification with or transparent awareness of the other's consciousness. The most developed view of this approach to empathy that we get in early phenomenology comes from the philosopher Edith Stein, who studied under Husserl and wrote her dissertation on the problem of empathy, which is a book I would definitely recommend checking out. It's super interesting. I think it was published in 1917. And I think a phenomenological view of empathy that is rooted in Stein's philosophy can really help set up or reveal the way that the stakes of the theory and simulation theory debate are misguided from the standpoint of inactive perception or embodied consciousness. Empathy is the experience of foreign consciousness in general. And so it doesn't require having the exact same experience as the other, but rather it does involve recognizing or feeling that they are a consciousness. I have another YouTube video which is a mini lecture on Edith Stein's view of empathy. So I would checking that out here because I'm not going to repeat everything that I say there, but I will touch on a couple of other things. So following Stein's view of empathy, I, in the work that I've done on this, have developed a little bit of an updated view. I haven't published on it because I'm actually not sure if it's like that original or interesting, but it's something that I have found helpful in articulating a phenomenology of empathy, which is that empathy is a feeling that aims at the feeling of another consciousness. This means that empathy involves a felt response to another conscious being, that this feeling is directed towards the feelings of the other, but it may or may not be isomorphic with the other's. And it doesn't necessarily have to involve the exact same feeling. And that empathy requires maintaining a distinction between self and other. It allows us to experience others as other. From a phenomenological perspective, empathy is fundamentally a perceptual experience. So I mentioned a little bit earlier that simulation theory treats the faculty of imagination as the most important faculty for empathy, and that theory treats cognition or reason as the vehicle for empathy. But according to phenomenology, empathy is already built into perception itself, such that we don't have to posit the intervention of one of these other faculties. Empathy is just a feature of our everyday perceptual life. I want to close by asking whether this view of empathy suggests that empathy is moral, which is what the pro-empathy versus anti-empathy camps that I mentioned at the beginning tend to debate. And I actually think that the answer is no, because empathy is a basic feature of our perceptual experience. Empathy is an aesthetic feeling, not essentially a moral one. This view highlights the embodied nature of consciousness. It also avoids problems of inference and dualism that hide behind simulation theory and theory. And it emphasizes the separation between self and other, suggesting that empathy does not require putting oneself in another's shoes. The experience of empathy is perceptual or aesthetic, and it is not in itself moral, but it could potentially aid in moral development in some cases.
So this question about racial empathy is something that is discussed in great detail in contemporary writing and is discussed in the articles from the syllabus and also in journalistic articles that followed the murder of Trayvon Martin. So Jason Silverstein has argued that people feel more empathy for those whom they think of as being part of their own racial group. And media studies scholars have argued that film and television, our patterns of viewing, allow us to empathize with certain characters and not others. So I will finish by discussing enjoyment and the ways that we might enjoy in unfortunately enjoy in violence. So empathy has been widely debated in many schools of philosophy or schools of thought. And one of the ways that empathy has been thought of is in relation to fantasy. So these debates regarding whether one empathizes because of fantasy or whether one empathizes because of a rational decision to choose to empathize is also about enjoyment and our sense of enjoyment. Slavoj Žižek argues from a Marxist perspective, a Lacanian Marxist perspective, that we are beset with the injunction to enjoy in this time period. We are told to enjoy all of our symptoms in late capitalist culture, including enjoyment of addiction and enjoyment of boredom or enjoyment of even everyday life, enjoyment of certain days of the week, like Friday. Like in this kind of injunction to enjoy is really about telling people that they must enjoy their labor and the surplus value that is attached to their labor. So Zizek argues that the problem, obviously, with this injunction to enjoy is that there is no space for an ethical witnessing to the exploitations of late capitalist culture. So the question becomes then, are we taught to enjoy settler colonialism? So this concept of enjoyment for Zizek is also about how we learn to enjoy certain things, but not too much. So Slavoj Zizek argues that there are a whole host of products on offer, like Diet Coke and fat-free chocolate and things that we can enjoy, but not too much. So what is interesting to think about is how this narrative of settler colonialism always allows us to kind of enjoy a certain political voyeurism and to participate in debates regarding settler colonialism, but never too much. I mean, the case of Cindy Gladue and all of these projects about red dresses and media debates are not really debates about land. It is not as though the politics of land acquisition or mining really change if we enter into these debates, even if we take opposing sides. So Sherene Razack has argued that slavery and the enjoyment of forced labor of others was central to the building of North America and to the settling of land. And Razack writes that the slave contract can shed some light on the legal difficulties that arise in the prostitution contract when the issue of limits to violence arises. In Scenes of Subjection, Saidiya Hartman offers an original and compelling argument that in slavery, enjoyment defined the means of subjection. Slavery gave whites the right to use a slave in any capacity that pleased. Hartman shows that the three aspects of the dictionary definition of enjoyment: to use, to take, delight in, and to possess are all inextricably linked. So this kind of use of the person's body is central to the enjoyment of slavery. And I guess the question becomes, is the enjoyment of the person's body in settler colonialism central to settler colonialism? The enjoyment of narratives about Cindy Gladue's body, the enjoyment of legal cases about Cindy Gladue's body, the enjoyment of standing in solidarity with Cindy Glady's body, the enjoyment of pretending to look like Cindy Glady. Like it is just this kind of enjoyment of the body, but much like this sense of enjoyment in late capitalist culture, it does not change acquisition of land. So fat-free chocolate, Coke without aspartame does not really kind of allow us any kind of real jouissance, any real experience. And the experience of kind of indigenous politics or even participating in settler colonialism has this real emptiness to it. And obviously, this kind of emptiness is not innocent because the more we debate, the more we talk about things, the more we kind of consume these narratives or participate in them without really engaging in anything, the more that policies are in place to mine land and to acquire more and more land. So the paradox, and these are not things that the public has control over really. So the paradox for Hartman, however, is that the element of possession enjoyment contained in the contract dispenses with the will or desire of the body's owner and obscures the line between what is and is not permitted desired. Prostitution is a place practice where no form of law seems to offer protection, to use Kana's words, because it incorporates aspects of dehumanization, the use of a body, the person's will, desire notwithstanding, and disposability, the use of a thing. So this constant mention of prostitution in the trial, like Cindy Glady was referred to as a native prostitute over 50 times. So the use of the word prostitution is this use of a place practice where no form of law seems to offer protection. It is just taken for granted that this word can be invoked at any time, and it's been invoked throughout history. Like the history of trials of rape have involved provocation as a defense. So if you're in a different time, but even I would argue perhaps today, if a woman is raped, her moral character can be judged through things like alcohol consumption, clothing, and even moral character can be used to discount one's victimization. And we did read Andrea Dworkin's essay, the essay about Andrea Dworkin, Can a Raped Woman Be Believed? And so this question of prostitution is really about using these old tropes of deserving victims who are associated with moral licentiousness and sexuality to dehumanize Cindy Glady, but also I think to distract from wider questions of what is going on politically during the time in which certain women are killed. And what are the politics of land and treaty that frame the background of these cases. So transforming a human being into a thing or even a service creates a legally fraught zone, as scholars of slavery have long recognized. Hartman shows how the rape of slave women becomes an impossibility, disappearing in law through the idea of seduction. She writes, the despotic ravages of power made violence indistinguishable from the full enjoyment of the thing. Hartman's careful delineation of the legal position of the captive slave woman shows us how the question of how much force is too much force becomes impossible in the context of a sexual exploitation that has been legally permitted. What is the legitimate use of property? As she crucially asks, what limit must be exceeded in order that the violence directed at the black body be made legible in the law? In the case of slave women, the law's circumscribed recognition of consent and will occurred only in order to intensify and secure the subordination of the enslaved, repress the crime, and deny injury. For it asserted that the captive female body was both willless and always willing. So this idea of the captive female body is willless and always willing, I think is interesting because it is about slavery, but it is also about sex, and rape. And we've discussed the ways that rape culture constructs women as always willless and always willing. So the lack of female sexual desire means that women are often not in patriarchal society or in cisgender heterosexual patriarchal society thought to have any sexual desire, will also thought to have not have the capacity to say no. And so this kind of willless and willingness go hand in hand. It is difficult to identify the extremity of power that is operating in prostitution, writes Sherene Razack. But we see some of the tensions and contradictions of slave codes, as noted by Hartman. The idea of contract conceals the extremity of power and endows the prostitute with the will that the slave is more often deemed to lack. But as in the slave contract, the will that is granted is a paradox, if not a fiction, because the contract gives the right to possess another. As in the slave context, how would we identify the limit point of force? Another framework is called for to understand the nature of the extreme violence that is often seen in prostitution and to consider the gray zones in law where colonial, racial, and sexualized violence can disappear. Disposability offers one way to consider why racial and sexual power must be marked on the body in a scopic regime that law authorizes.
Oh, thank you. I'm actually, no, I'm saying thank you. I'm actually dying. And she did, no, I did.
So this kind of use of all of these tropes to create people as disposable is something that troubles Sherene Razack. I mean, calling people different names, creating entire high-risk industries where people can be made disposable is obviously against the law. And the Canadian Charter of Rights of Freedoms is something that I've discussed in a previous lecture, that the Charter offers everyone life and liberty, freedom of speech, and also security, which means human security. So I'll finish with this clip, I think, of Saidiya Hartman. We only have a few minutes left, discussing her work. This won't work, sorry. Maybe I won't. Unstable interview. Okay, I'll skip ahead. We only have a few minutes left anyway. So when I post the slides online, you can watch Saidiya Hartman, who is an American academic who writes about slavery extensively, and it is Black History Month, and so I think it is important to consider Saidiya Hartman's ideas, obviously all the time, but specifically, I think it is a good reminder to have these times of commemoration, to think about the importance of history and the history of slavery. So Razack writes, viewing these wounds, Indigenous women can be terrorized. Equally, the displayed tissue can give rise to pleasure, the race and colonial pleasure in the mutilation and annihilation of the Indigenous body. Settler society has a compelling need to see visible inscriptions of colonial power on Indigenous bodies. Perhaps buried deep in all of us is this terrifying truth that is so hard to name. Sexualized annihilation remains core to the colonial project and to the making of colonizers. So sadism and supremacy are also unfortunate ideas that Sherene Razack's work touches upon, and other scholars who have written about the very poor treatment of Indigenous peoples. In discussing end it is Black British History, or sorry, it's Black History Month. I used to live in London, and February is Black History Month in Canada, but there's another month which is Black British History Month. So it is Black History Month, and many authors have made comparisons in this time period between slavery and settler colonialism. So in his discussions of lynching and race riots, authors suggest that Black suffering is a source of sadistic enjoyment and vindicative joy for whites. And so this idea of enjoyment, I think, is something that should allow us to ask moral questions and psychological questions about what it is possible for people to enjoy in. And so if I have a sense of enjoyment that is pathological, can I enjoy in anything? And in the time of the internet, many people can enjoy in any images, but to enjoy things that are criminal, I think is in contradiction to a culture and a country of laws. I also think people's sense of enjoyment can be questioned. And I think one's enjoyment of violence and suffering and the harm of others, I think is not enjoyment. I think it is just an obscene exploitation of power. So, I guess one of the questions that the article leaves us with is about the sense of disposability. And if bodies and people are disposable, then our ideas disposable, our legal traditions disposable? And the answer is obviously no, but Razack was really concerned with how legal gray zones make our laws as disposable as morals and ethics, when Indigenous people can so easily go missing and be murdered. So I'll finish with this quote: when you expose a problem, you pose a problem, right, Sarah? It might then be assumed that the problem would go away if you would just stop talking about it, or if you went away. So I would argue that the problem is not going to go away, and neither are many people who are advocates for Indigenous women and girls, and neither are Indigenous people. So problems need to be solved, and they won't go away, neither will people. So the presentation is due after reading, and you were asked to upload a 10-minute presentation online. You can use Zoom. You can also use your cell phone or any other medium that's easy for you. The only thing that I would check is to make sure that you can upload it online using our online system, Moodle. It's a really free exercise. The minimum is 10 minutes, but it could be longer. And you can work in groups, you can work alone. The only thing that I would suggest is that you don't summarize the reading. I would suggest that you try to do a creative presentation. Okay, that's all. Thank you very much for attending. Next week is reading week, and so we will meet again after reading week, and I hope you have a fun reading week. Please feel free to contact me if you have any questions or you want to meet privately over Zoom. We'll meet on the 27th of February. Okay, thanks. Bye-bye.